The galaxy had learned to fear those who refused to kneel, and so the Empire hunted them without mercy. When a warrior from beyond the stars awakened on Alderaan, bearing a shield forged in a world the Force had never touched, he became something the Sith could not predict, and the rebellion dared not ignore. No lightsaber, no connection to the ancient power that shaped destinies across 1,000 systems. Just unshakable conviction and a circle of metal that should not exist. Darth Vader sensed him immediately, a void where something immense should be, a soldier whose courage burned brighter than any kyber crystal. In a war where hope had become a memory and compromised the language of survival, one question tore through Imperial command and rebel councils alike. What happens when a man who never learned to surrender faces an empire built on fear itself? The galaxy had forgotten what defiance looked like without compromise. For 2 decades, the Galactic Empire had rewritten the very grammar of resistance, teaching worlds that survival meant submission, that hope was a luxury afforded only to those who knelt. On 1,000 planets, fear had replaced faith. The Jedi were myth. The Senate was theater, and in the void left by fallen protectors, only shadows dared to move. But on a nameless moon orbiting Alderaan, where refugees huddled in prefabricated shelters beneath foreign stars, something impossible was about to arrive. Not through hyperspace, not through the Force, but through a rift in reality itself, carrying with it a man who had never learned how to kneel. The transport crash came without warning. It tore through the atmosphere like a meteorite wrapped in unnatural light, trailing fire and distortion that made the air itself scream. The refugees scattered as the object hammered into the valley floor, half a kilometer from their settlement, throwing up a plume of dust and superheated rock. Imperial sensors detected the anomaly immediately. Within minutes, a patrol squadron diverted course, their TIE fighters shrieking through the thin atmosphere toward the impact site. But Bail Organa was closer. The senator of Alderaan had been inspecting the refugee camp personally, as he often did when official channels proved too slow to deliver mercy. When the sky split open, he was standing among families who had fled the corporate sector, listening to their stories of homes burned and loved ones lost to the machine of order. Now he stood at the crater's edge, staring at wreckage that defied explanation. The craft was not Imperial. It bore no markings from any known system. Its hull was strange, angular in ways that spoke of aesthetics from another universe entirely, and at its heart lay a capsule split open like a seed pod. Frost clung to its interior, and within that frost, preserved in a cocoon of ice that was already beginning to melt under Alderaan's twin suns, was a man. Bail felt his breath catch. The figure wore armor, but not the plastoid shells of stormtroopers or the durasteel plates of Mandalorians. This was something else entirely, blue and white, emblazoned with a star. A shield lay beside him, round and brilliant even beneath the ice, painted in concentric rings of red, white, and blue, colors that meant nothing here. Symbols from a world the galaxy had never known. The ice cracked. Steam hissed into the air as the temperature differential accelerated the thaw. Bail moved without thinking, sliding down the crater's slope as his security detail shouted warnings. Behind him, refugees gathered at the rim, drawn by curiosity stronger than caution. The man's eyes opened, blue, clear, confused but not panicked, scanning his surroundings with the trained efficiency of a soldier assessing threat. His hand moved to the shield by instinct, fingers closing around its edge as he pushed himself upright. Water streamed from his uniform, breath misted in the air, and then his gaze locked onto Bail Organa, taking in the senator's formal robes, the alien architecture of the settlement beyond, the unfamiliar constellations overhead. "Where am I?" The words were accented strangely, shaped by a tongue that had never formed basic before, yet comprehensible through whatever miracle had brought him here. Bail raised his hands slowly, the universal gesture of peace. "You're safe. You're on a moon in the Alderaan system. My name is Bail Organa. You've had an accident." The soldier's jaw tightened. His eyes moved past Bail to the refugees, lingering on their faces with an expression that spoke of recognition, not of them specifically, but of what they represented. Displacement, fear, the aftermath of violence. Bail had seen that look before, in the eyes of clone troopers who remembered too much, in Jedi who survived Order 66, the recognition of suffering by those who had sworn to prevent it. "How long was I out?" The soldier's voice was steady, despite the tremor in his muscles. "I don't know, but there are Imperial forces inbound. We need to move." The word Imperial registered instantly. The soldier's posture shifted, weight redistributing as he retrieved the shield fully and rose to his feet. He moved like someone accustomed to waking in hostile territory. Behind them, the whine of TIE engines grew audible, still distant but approaching fast. Bail gestured urgently toward the settlement. The soldier hesitated only a moment, glancing at the wreckage behind him as if weighing the loss of something he could never recover, then nodded. They climbed out of the crater together, Bail's guards forming a protective cordon as they hurried toward the shelters. The refugees parted for them, staring at the stranger with his impossible shield and his armor that gleamed like captured sky. They reached the settlement's main dome as the TIE fighters screamed overhead. The ships banked hard, circling the crater in a predatory pattern that made the children cry and the adults reach for whatever weapons they had managed to smuggle past Imperial inspections. Bail ushered the soldier into the medical station, a cramped space with limited equipment but competent hands. A Twi'lek physician approached with a scanner, but the soldier waved her off gently. "I'm fine. Just cold." He was already studying the room's layout, the exits, the structural integrity of the dome itself. "They'll land within minutes," Bail said quietly. "Imperial protocol for anomalous crashes. They'll quarantine the site and interrogate anyone nearby. Then we move the civilians deeper into the compound." "There is no deeper. This settlement has one dome and 6 auxiliary shelters. We're not a military installation." The soldier's expression hardened. "Then we buy them time to scatter." "With what? These people have nothing. Half are children. The Empire will simply round them up, not if someone gives them a reason to focus elsewhere." Bail studied the stranger's face, reading the determination there with growing unease. "You're talking about drawing their attention deliberately. That's suicide without weapons, without backup, without even understanding who you're facing." The soldier met his gaze without flinching. "I've faced worse odds, and I've never let innocent people pay for my survival." Outside, repulsor lift engines howled as the Imperial transport touched down beside the crater. Stormtroopers would be deploying now, securing the perimeter with the mechanical efficiency that had conquered 1,000 worlds. Bail felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. This man was a stranger, potentially dangerous, certainly disruptive to the careful balance the rebellion maintained. But there was something in his bearing that reminded Bail of the Jedi before their fall. Not the Force, but the conviction, the refusal to calculate survival at the cost of others. "If you do this," Bail said slowly, "you won't have any support. I can't risk exposing our network for someone I just met." "I'm not asking you to." The soldier adjusted his grip on the shield. "Just get these people somewhere safe. We don't even know your name." "Steve Rogers." He extended his hand. Bail clasped it, feeling the strength there. The calluses of someone who had held a weapon long before he held a shield. "Captain, formally. The rank doesn't mean much now." "It might mean more than you think, Captain Rogers." Bail released his hand and turned to his security chief, a former Republic officer named Taryn. "Begin evacuation protocol. Use the caves if necessary. I'll handle the Imperials." Taryn started to protest, but Bail cut him off with a look that brooked no argument. The refugees were already moving, parents gathering children with practiced speed born of too many sudden flights. Steve watched them with an expression Bale couldn't quite read, somewhere between sorrow and rage, tempered by something that looked like purpose rediscovered. Then he turned toward the dome's entrance, shield settling onto his arm as naturally as breathing. "Stay behind me," Steve said. "When they focus on me, you run." Bale wanted to argue, but the first stormtroopers were already approaching the dome, their white armor stark against the dusty ground. Their weapons were raised, moving in the precise formations that made Imperial infantry so terrifyingly efficient. Steve walked out to meet them alone. The shield caught the light of Alderaan's suns, throwing prismatic reflections across the settlement. For a moment, everything was still. Then the squad leader's voice crackled through his helmet's external speaker. "Identify yourself. You are in violation of quarantine protocols." Steve's response was immediate. "These people are civilians. They have nothing to do with the crash. All witnesses will be detained for questioning. Stand aside." "No." The word hung in the air like a line drawn in sand. Bale saw the stormtrooper's posture shift, training overriding confusion at the simple audacity of refusal. In the Empire, Defiance was met with overwhelming force. It was doctrine, written in the ashes of the Jedi Temple, and enforced on every world that dared question Palpatine's vision. The squad leader raised his weapon. "Final warning. Stand aside or be neutralized." Steve planted his feet. The shield came up, and when the first blaster bolt screamed toward his chest, something impossible happened. The shield caught it, not deflected, not absorbed, but reflected the energy back along its trajectory with a sound like a bell struck in a cathedral. The bolt hammered into the ground at the stormtrooper's feet, leaving a smoking crater. For half a heartbeat, the galaxy seemed to hold its breath. Then chaos erupted. Blaster fire converged on Steve from 3 angles simultaneously. He moved like water, the shield tracking threats with inhuman precision, each bolt redirected with minimal motion. One caught a stormtrooper in the shoulder joint. Another shattered a weapon. A third punched through a trooper's knee, dropping him with a scream that the helmet failed to muffle. Steve closed the distance in a sprint that covered 20 meters before the Imperials could adjust their firing solutions. The shield slammed into the squad leader's chest with the force of a speeder collision, crumpling armor and sending the trooper flying backward into his squadmates. Bale stood frozen, watching combat unfold with a speed and brutality that belonged in war hollows, not reality. Steve fought like nothing the galaxy had seen. Not with the elegant forms of Jedi blade work, not with the raw power of Sith rage, but with a precision born of pure human skill refined to its absolute peak. He used the shield as sword and aegis, both striking joints and helmet seals with anatomical knowledge that spoke of training against armored opponents. When a stormtrooper tried to grapple him, Steve used the man's own momentum to hurl him into 2 others. When another attempted to flank, Steve spun low and swept his legs, following through with a shield strike that sent the trooper's rifle spinning away. In 30 seconds, the entire squad was down, groaning or unconscious, their perfect formation reduced to scattered bodies. The transport's remaining troopers emerged at full sprint. Steve didn't wait for them to form up. He charged, shield raised like a ram, and hit their line with the impact of a walking tank. Armor cracked, weapons clattered to the ground, and through it all, Steve's expression remained focused but not cruel, angry but not savage. He was doing violence with the careful control of someone who understood its cost, who carried it as a burden rather than a release. Bale recognized that look too. He had seen it in Obi-Wan Kenobi's eyes when the Jedi Master spoke of the Clone Wars, of battles won at prices that could never be repaid. The last stormtrooper standing was the transport pilot, scrambling to reach his cockpit. Steve's shield left his hand in a throw that defied physics. It curved through the air, struck the transport's boarding ramp with a metallic clang that sent the pilot tumbling, then ricocheted off the hull and returned to Steve's waiting grasp. The pilot surrendered without another word, hands raised, survival instinct overriding Imperial indoctrination. Steve secured him with the man's own binders, then turned back to Bale with an expression that managed to be both apologetic and resolute. "Sorry, didn't mean to cause a scene." Bale stared at him, then at the field of disabled stormtroopers, then back at Steve. "Who are you?" "Told you. Steve Rogers." "That's not what I mean. No human moves like that. No human survives a full squad without the Force." Steve's jaw tightened. "Where I come from, humans can be more than you think. But I'm just a soldier who got lucky with science." "That wasn't luck." Bale moved closer, lowering his voice as refugees began to emerge from hiding, staring at Steve with expressions that mixed fear and awe. "That was precision, training, years of it. You fought like you knew exactly what you were doing." "I've been fighting since 1943. Steve's eyes went distant for a moment. "Feels like longer." Bale didn't understand the date, but he understood the weight in those words. This man was a warrior displaced not just in space, but in time itself, carrying battles from a past so remote it might as well be mythology. And yet here he stood, refusing to let innocence suffer, drawing Imperial wrath onto himself without hesitation. Bale made a decision that would ripple through the galaxy in ways neither of them could predict. "Come with me," Bale said. "The rebellion could use someone like you." Steve looked at the refugees, at the settlement, at the disabled stormtroopers, and their transport sitting idle. "These people need protection. The Empire will send more, which is why we need to leave now. I have ships waiting in orbit. We can evacuate the entire settlement before reinforcements arrive." "And then what? They scatter to another refugee camp waiting for the next purge? Then they join a cause that's actually fighting back." Bale's voice hardened with conviction. "You stood between them and stormtroopers with nothing but a shield and determination. Imagine what you could do with an army behind you." Steve was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving across faces that watched him with something Bale recognized as the first fragile stirrings of hope. These people had fled from violence, had accepted displacement as the price of survival. But in Steve Rogers, they had seen something different. Not power wielded by the strong against the weak, but power wielded for the weak against the strong. It was a distinction the Empire had spent 20 years erasing. Now, in the space of minutes, Steve had reminded them it still existed. "All right," Steve said finally, "but I need answers. I need to understand what kind of galaxy I've landed in." "You'll get them." Bale gestured to Taran, who approached with obvious caution, his weapon holstered but his hand near it. "Prepare the transports. All civilians, no exceptions. We leave nothing for the Empire to interrogate." The evacuation proceeded with remarkable efficiency, refugees streaming toward the landing pads where Bale's diplomatic shuttles waited with engines already warming. Steve helped carry the injured, his strength allowing him to bear weights that should have required repulsor sleds. Children stared at him with wide eyes, and more than one parent touched his arm in passing, a gesture of gratitude that needed no translation. Bale watched it all with growing certainty that he had just altered the course of something vast and terrible. This man would not be subtle, he would not hide, and the moment the Empire learned of his existence, they would move against him with everything they had. But subtlety had brought the rebellion few victories. Perhaps what they needed was someone who remembered how to stand in the light and refuse to move. They boarded the last shuttle as Imperial reinforcements appeared on the horizon, a trio of gunships moving fast and low. Bale's pilot didn't wait for clearance, punching the engines and sending them arrowing skyward on a trajectory that made the hull groan. Steve braced himself against the bulkhead, watching through the viewport as the settlement shrank beneath them. Smoke rose from the crater where his impossible arrival had torn reality. The Imperial gunships circled like carrion birds, finding nothing but empty domes and disabled stormtroopers. In orbit, the Tantive 4 waited like a promise of something better. The corvette was sleek and elegant, bearing the diplomatic seals of Alderaan but armed well beyond what Senate protocol officially allowed. Bail had spent years preparing for the day when diplomacy would fail entirely, when the pretense of loyal opposition would be stripped away to reveal the rebellion beneath. As they docked, he wondered if that day had just arrived. Steve stepped onto the corvette's deck and paused, taking in the gleaming corridors, the crew members moving with military precision, the subtle signs of a vessel designed for more than state functions. "This is a warship," Steve said quietly. "It's a symbol," Bail corrected. "For now. But you're right. It won't always be." They walked together through corridors that hummed with purpose, past crew members who saluted Bail with respect that went deeper than protocol. Steve noted everything with the trained eye of a soldier, mapping escape routes and defensive positions by instinct. Bail led him to a briefing room dominated by a holographic projector, currently displaying a slowly rotating image of the galaxy. Steve stared at it with an expression that made Bail's chest tighten. It was the look of someone confronting just how far from home they truly were. "This is what you need to understand," Bail began, his voice taking on the cadence of a history lesson that was also a warning. 20 years ago, this galaxy had a republic, not perfect, but functional, protected by Jedi Knights who served the Force and defended peace. Then a man named Palpatine revealed himself as a Sith Lord and destroyed everything. The Jedi were hunted to extinction, the Republic became an empire, and now fear is the only law that matters. Steve listened in silence as Bail outlined the shape of tyranny across the stars. The enslavement of Wookiees, the destruction of Alderaan's sister cities in the core, the disappearance of entire populations into labor camps that mined the raw materials for war machines beyond counting, the dissolution of the Senate's final powers in favor of regional governors who answered to no law except imperial decree. And at the center of it all, two figures. Emperor Palpatine, whose mastery of the dark side bent the galaxy to his will, and Darth Vader, his enforcer, a figure whose reputation alone was enough to break resistance before it could form. "Vader," Steve repeated. "He's the one they fear most?" "With good reason. He's killed more Jedi than the rest of the Empire combined, broken rebellions on a dozen worlds. They say he can sense treachery through the Force itself, that lying to him is impossible." "Is he human?" "Once. Now he's more machine than man, sustained by cybernetics and the dark side. But his power is very real, Captain Rogers. If he learns of your existence, he will come for you personally." Steve's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Not fear, recognition perhaps, of a threat that would demand everything he had to face. Bail activated the projector, bringing up images of recent Imperial atrocities, burned worlds, shattered cities, refugees in chains. Steve watched them all with a stillness that was more terrible than any outburst could have been. "Why are you showing me this?" Steve asked finally. "Because you need to understand what you're up against if you choose to fight. This isn't a war between nations or ideologies that can be negotiated. This is an empire that demands absolute submission or complete annihilation. There is no middle ground, no treaty that will restore freedom, only victory or extinction." "Then you fight." Steve said it as a simple fact, inevitable as gravity. "We try. There are cells across the galaxy, resistance fighters sabotaging supply lines, rescuing prisoners, gathering intelligence, but we're scattered, underfunded, up against an enemy with unlimited resources and no mercy." Bail paused, choosing his next words carefully. "We need symbols, Captain. We need people who can inspire others to believe that standing against the Empire isn't suicide. You want me to be a recruiting tool. I want you to be what you are, Someone who sees injustice and refuses to accept it. Someone who fights not because they hate their enemies, but because they love the people they protect. Bale gestured at the images still rotating in the projector. These people have forgotten that such a thing is possible. You could remind them. Steve was quiet for a long time, his gaze distant. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of decisions made in another lifetime, in battles on a planet that this galaxy would never know existed. I was asleep for 70 years, woke up in a world that had moved on without me, fighting wars I didn't understand against enemies who used my own tactics against civilians. I thought I'd done enough, that maybe I'd earned rest. And now I'm looking at atrocities that make Schmidt look reasonable. Steve's hands clenched. You're right, someone has to stand up. But I'm not a symbol, Senator. I'm just a soldier. I do my best work in the field, not on propaganda posters. Then you'll fit in perfectly with the people I'm about to introduce you to. Bale led Steve deeper into the Corvette, past security checkpoints manned by guards who scanned them with biometric sensors before allowing passage. They descended 3 levels to a compartment that was clearly not part of the official diplomatic suite. Here the walls were bare metal, the lighting harsh and functional. A tactical center hummed with activity, staffed by men and women whose bearing marked them as former Republic military. Maps covered every surface, marked with symbols Steve didn't recognize but understood instinctively. Troop movements, supply depots, target assessments. A woman looked up from a console as they entered, her expression sharp and assessing. She was human, dark-haired, with the kind of beauty that survived in war zones because it was backed by competence and ruthlessness in equal measure. Her uniform was unmarked, but she wore it with the confidence of someone who had led troops in combat. Steve recognized a fellow officer immediately. She studied him with the same intensity, taking in his strange armor, his impossible shield, the way he carried himself despite obvious exhaustion. Mon Mothma, Bale said by way of introduction, Senator from Chandrila, and the unofficial coordinator of everything the Empire would execute us for if they knew. Mon Mothma's smile was brief and cold. Bale has a gift for understatement. Who is this? Steve Rogers. He arrived this morning in a crash that violated every law of physics I understand. Then he disabled an Imperial squad with nothing but a shield and sheer determination. Mon Mothma's eyes narrowed. Enhanced soldier? We've heard rumors of Imperial experimentation with combat drugs and cybernetic augmentation. Not Imperial, Steve said. And not from any system you know. I'm from Earth. A planet that apparently doesn't exist in your star charts. The room went very quiet. Mon Mothma exchanged a glance with Bale that spoke volumes of silent communication. Around them, the tactical center's low hum of activity faltered as personnel tried not to appear as though they were eavesdropping. Steve waited, patient but alert, while these strangers decided what to do with him. Finally, Mon Mothma gestured to a private conference room off the main space. We should discuss this somewhere more secure. The conference room was barely large enough for the 3 of them, dominated by a table scarred with use and a projector displaying real-time intelligence feeds from across the sector. Mon Mothma sealed the door and activated a scrambler that made Steve's teeth ache with subsonic pressure. When she spoke again, her voice was all business. Explain everything, no omissions. We're taking a tremendous risk even having this conversation. Steve told them. Not everything. The full history of the Avengers and the Infinity Stones would mean nothing here, but enough. The serum, the war against Hydra, the crash into the ice. Waking 70 years later to a world that had declared him a relic. Fighting in New York, in Sokovia, in Berlin. The fracture of everything he'd built, and then the final mission. Pursuing a cosmic threat through a rift that should have killed him but instead spat him out here, into a galaxy that made his own century of conflict look parochial by comparison. Mon Mothma listened without interrupting, her expression giving away nothing. When Steve finished, She was quiet for nearly a minute, processing information that challenged every assumption about reality itself. Bale watched her with obvious concern, aware that they were asking her to accept something that sounded like fever dreams or spice-induced delusions. But Steve's presence was undeniable. His equipment was impossible, and the evidence of what he had done to an Imperial squad was already being analyzed by their intelligence officers. "If even half of what you're saying is true," Mon Mothma said finally, "you're the most dangerous asset or threat the rebellion has ever encountered. The question is which? I'm not a threat to you. You're a threat to secrecy, to operational security, to the careful balance we've maintained for years." Her eyes bored into his. "Your stunt on that moon will be in Imperial reports within hours. They'll be looking for you, and when they find you, they'll find us. Then don't let them find me. You're suggesting we hide someone who just disabled an entire squad in broad daylight, who fights with a weapon that looks like it belongs in a child's story." Mon Mothma shook her head. "You're a walking anomaly, Captain Rogers. The Empire specializes in eliminating anomalies." "Good." Steve's voice went flat and hard. "Let them come looking. While they're focused on me, you can do what needs to be done." Bale leaned forward. "Mon, he has a point. We've been too cautious for too long, playing at diplomacy while the Empire tightens its grip. Maybe what we need is someone who forces them to react instead of us always responding to their moves. Or maybe we need to think strategically instead of emotionally." Mon Mothma's gaze never left Steve. "Tell me, Captain, if you discovered that defeating the Empire required compromises you found morally unacceptable, what would you do?" "Find another way. There isn't always another way. Sometimes victory requires sacrifice. Sometimes it requires doing things that would make you unrecognizable to the man you were. Then I'd question whether that victory was worth having." The words hung between them like a challenge. Mon Mothma studied Steve with an expression that might have been respect or frustration or both. Around them, the tactical displays continued their silent dance of intelligence and analysis, marking the Empire's movements across worlds Steve had never heard of, but would soon learn to fear. Finally, Mon Mothma stood, her decision made. "You can stay, for now. But you'll follow our protocols, accept our security measures, and if I determine that you're more liability than asset, you're gone. Clear? Clear. Good. Bale, get him cleaned up and equipped with something less conspicuous than American patriotism. Captain Rogers, welcome to the rebellion. Try not to get us all killed." She left without waiting for a response, her footsteps echoing down the corridor with the cadence of someone who carried the weight of a galaxy on her shoulders. Bale let out a breath he'd been holding and offered Steve an apologetic smile. "She's harsh, but she's kept us alive when every instinct said to act rashly. You'll learn to appreciate her." "I've worked with worse," Steve said. "Fury would have shot me just to see if the bullets bounced off." Bale didn't understand the reference, but he appreciated the humor in Steve's voice. They left the conference room and made their way to the crew quarters, where Bale requisitioned a cabin that was small but private. A refresher station occupied one corner, its alien technology yielding to intuitive use. Steve stripped off his uniform, revealing scars that told stories Bale could only imagine. The serum had healed him countless times, but it couldn't erase the evidence of violence endured. Bale provided him with nondescript clothing, gray and functional, that would let Steve blend into a crowd on any Outer Rim world. But the shield remained. Steve cleaned it with almost reverent care, his fingers tracing the concentric circles as if reading a history written in vibranium and paint. When Bale offered to secure it somewhere safe, Steve's refusal was polite but absolute. "It goes where I go." They ate together in the officers' mess, a quiet meal that gave Steve his first taste of galactic cuisine. The food was edible, if strange, and Steve approached it with the practical attitude of a soldier who had learned to appreciate anything that provided fuel. Other crew members gave them space, aware that something significant was unfolding but wise enough not to pry. Through the viewport, stars streaked past as the Tantive 4 made the jump to hyperspace, carrying them toward a rendezvous that Bale described only as essential. "Where are we going?" Steve asked. "Yavin 4, a moon where we're establishing a more permanent base. Remote enough that the Empire hasn't noticed. Strategic enough that we can coordinate operations across multiple sectors." Bale paused. "It's also where you'll meet the real architects of this rebellion, the ones who've been fighting since before it had a name." Steve nodded, accepting the information without pressing for details. Bale clearly wasn't ready to share. Trust was earned, not given, especially in a war like this. They finished their meal in companionable silence. Two men from different worlds united by the simple conviction that tyranny must be opposed, that freedom was worth bleeding for, that some lines could never be crossed no matter what the cost of refusal. The galaxy waited beyond the viewport, vast and terrible and beautiful, and somewhere in its depths, in a fortress that orbited a world scoured clean of life, Darth Vader felt a disturbance in the Force, not the familiar echoes of Jedi survivors or the crude Force sensitivity of barely trained adepts, something else. A presence that was no presence at all, a void where his perception insisted something significant existed. It was impossible, infuriating, and it demanded investigation. Vader summoned his intelligence officers with a gesture, his breathing loud in the silence of his meditation chamber. There was an incident on an Alderaan moon, a crashed vessel, disabled Imperial troops. I want everything: sensor logs, witness reports, DNA scans if they exist. The officers scrambled to obey, terrified by the intensity in Vader's voice. Within hours, data streams would converge from across the sector. Within days, the Emperor himself would take notice. And within weeks, the galaxy would learn that Captain America had arrived. The rebellion gained a symbol it didn't know it needed. The Empire gained a target it couldn't comprehend. And Steve Rogers, a man who had already given everything for one world, prepared to do it again for a galaxy of strangers. But first, he slept, surrendering to exhaustion in a bunk designed for a body slightly smaller than his enhanced frame. His dreams were filled with faces he would never see again. Peggy, Bucky, Sam, Tony, despite everything. The Avengers, scattered or gone, fighting battles in a universe he could never return to. He woke with the ache of loss fresh in his chest, the way he always did when sleep reminded him of everything the ice had taken. But when he opened his eyes, it was to a new mission, a new war, and a galaxy that desperately needed someone who remembered that courage wasn't the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. Steve rose, dressed, and strapped the shield to his arm. The rebellion was waiting. And Captain America, despite the alien stars and the impossible distance from everything he'd known, was ready to fight. Yavin 4 was a green jewel, wrapped in mist and ancient mystery. The moon's jungles were older than human spaceflight, their canopies so dense that sunlight reached the forest floor in scattered beams that looked like pillars holding up the sky. Massive temples jutted from the vegetation like the bones of dead gods, built by a civilization that had vanished millennia ago, leaving behind only stone and silence. The rebellion had claimed one such temple for its own, hollowing out its interior to create a base that was part command center and part archaeological site. Landing pads ringed the structure, carved from ruins that had once been plazas for rituals no one remembered. Steve descended the Tantive 4's boarding ramp and stopped, overwhelmed. The air was thick with moisture and life, the scent of growing things so intense it was almost narcotic after the sterile recycled atmosphere of the ship. Sounds layered on sounds, insects and birds and things he had no names for, creating a symphony of biodiversity that Earth's temperate zones could never match. Heat pressed against his skin like a physical presence, and above it all, the temple loomed, its stones weathered but unbroken, testament to builders who understood permanence. "Welcome to the heart of the rebellion," Bail said, appearing at his shoulder. "Not much to look at from the outside, but the interior holds more surprises than most Imperial bases." They crossed the landing pad, Steve noting the mix of vessels parked in organized chaos. X-Wing fighters, their distinctive S-foils folded for landing, Y-Wing bombers, scarred from combat, transports of a dozen configurations, some bearing Republic insignia only partially scraped away, and everywhere, people. Humans and aliens working side by side with the focused energy of those who knew their time was limited and their cause desperate. A Bothan communications specialist argued with a Sullustan engineer over frequency ranges. A Duro pilot checked her fighter's weapon systems with the care of someone whose life depended on those mechanisms. Mon Calamari technicians calibrated sensors that could detect Imperial probe droids before they got close enough to scan the base. Steve saw veterans and children, idealists and mercenaries, all united by the simple fact that they had decided submission was worse than death. They entered the temple through massive doors that had been reinforced with durasteel and fitted with security systems that scanned them 3 times before granting access. Inside, the ancient and modern collided with jarring abruptness. Stone walls covered in hieroglyphics framed banks of computer terminals. Carved faces of forgotten deities stared down at tactical displays plotting convoy routes. The rebellion had built its revolution inside a monument to impermanence, and the irony was not lost on Steve. Bail led him through corridors that descended deep into the temple's heart, past barracks and armories, past medical bays where injured fighters recovered from battles on worlds Steve couldn't pronounce. They attracted attention everywhere they went. Word had already spread about the stranger who had fought like a Jedi without the Force, who carried a shield that defied blaster fire and spoke of codes older than the Empire. People stared at Steve with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion to something that looked uncomfortably like hope. They emerged into the command center, and Steve's breath caught. It was vast, carved from living rock and fitted with technology that would have impressed Tony Stark. Holographic displays floated in the air, showing fleet movements, communications intercepts, intelligence assessments from dozens of sources. Officers moved between stations with practiced efficiency, coordinating operations across light years with split-second precision. At the center of it all, standing before the largest hologram, was a woman who radiated authority despite her small stature. Mon Mothma stood beside her, and next to her, others Steve didn't recognize. A Bothan with sharp eyes and sharper intelligence, a human woman with the hardened look of someone who had seen too much combat, an admiral whose uniform still bore faint traces of Republic insignia beneath the rebel modifications. They all turned as Bail and Steve approached, their conversation dying mid-sentence. "This is Captain Steve Rogers," Bail announced. "The man who single-handedly disabled an Imperial squad on the Alderaan moon. The man who claims to be from another reality entirely." The small woman stepped forward, studying Steve with eyes that missed nothing. She was older than Mon Mothma, her face lined with care and wisdom in equal measure. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of quiet authority that needed no volume to command respect. "I am Senator Padme Amidala," she said, and Steve felt Bail go very still beside him. "I understand you've come to fight." Steve had been told Amidala was dead, that she had perished giving birth to twins after the Jedi fell, her heart broken by betrayal and violence. But here she stood, alive and clearly central to the rebellion's operations. Later, Bail would explain the deception, the faked death, the years spent building networks in the shadows, while the Empire believed her eliminated. For now, Steve simply extended his hand. "Yes, ma'am, if you'll have me." Amidala's handshake was firm, her gaze searching his face for something she seemed to find satisfactory. "Bail speaks highly of your actions. Mon Mothma has reservations." "Mon Mothma has practical concerns about operational security. the senator in question interjected, which remain valid regardless of Captain Rogers' obvious capabilities. Capabilities we desperately need, the admiral said. His accent was clipped, his bearing military to the bone. We're outgunned, outmanned, and losing ground every day. If this man can inspire even a fraction of the resistance we hope for, he's worth the risk. Admiral Akbar is correct, the Bothan added. His basic was accented but precise. Intelligence suggests the Empire is preparing a major offensive against suspected rebel cells in the mid-rim. We need something to shift the narrative, to give our scattered forces a reason to believe coordination is possible. Steve listened to them debate his usefulness as if he weren't standing right there, understanding that this was how strategic decisions were made. Not with grand speeches or heroic declarations, but with cold assessment of assets and risks. He'd been part of enough war councils to recognize the pattern. What struck him was how worn these leaders looked, how the weight of their choices had carved lines deeper than age alone could account for. Perhaps, Amidala said quietly, cutting through the debate, we should ask Captain Rogers what he thinks he can contribute. Not what we hope he represents, but what he's actually willing and able to do. All eyes turned to Steve. He took a breath, choosing his words carefully, aware that his answer would shape everything that followed. I'm not a politician. I'm not a spy. What I can do is lead by example. Go where the fighting is hardest, where the Empire thinks it's broken your will completely, and show people that resistance is possible. I can't inspire a galaxy from a command center, but put me in the field, give me a mission, and I'll show you what one person can do when they refuse to give up. The room was silent for a moment. Then Akbar's lips pulled back in what might have been a smile. A ground fighter. Good. We have enough pilots. Not nearly enough infantry who can hold territory once we take it. He's also a symbol, Bale pressed. Imagine the holotapes. A warrior standing against the Empire without the Force, without superweapons, just skill and determination. Every world that sees him fight will wonder if they could do the same, which makes him a target. Mon Mothma countered. The moment the Empire identifies him as significant, they'll send Vader, and then we lose our symbol and quite possibly expose critical intelligence networks. Then we move fast, the woman with combat scars said. Her voice was rough from years of shouting orders over weapon fire. Hit hard targets before the Empire realizes what we're doing. Use the captain for high-value operations that would normally require Jedi-level skill. Make his presence felt before Vader can respond. Amidala raised a hand, silencing the debate. Captain Rogers, are you prepared to face Darth Vader? Because if you continue on this path, you will. It's not a possibility, it's a certainty. Steve met her gaze without flinching. I've faced worse. A man named Thanos who could snap half of all life out of existence with a thought. I lost that fight. But I'd do it again without hesitation, because the alternative was surrender. If this Vader is as dangerous as you say, then someone needs to stand up to him. Might as well be me. The words settled over the command center like a declaration of war. Steve saw respect kindle in some eyes, doubt in others, and in Amidala's, something that looked like sorrow tempered by necessity. She nodded slowly. Decision made. Very well. Captain Rogers, you're hereby attached to our Special Operations Division. You'll work with Commander Tyra Voss. She gestured to the scarred woman. She leads our most dangerous missions. If you survive the first week, we'll discuss long-term strategy. Tyra Voss stepped forward, offering Steve a handshake that tested his enhanced grip strength. She was tall for a human woman, nearly matching his height, with muscle that spoke of training and cybernetic augmentation in equal measure. Her left arm was mechanical from the elbow down, the prosthetic functional rather than cosmetic. A scar bisected her face from temple to jaw, pulling her mouth into a permanent half-scowl. Don't call me Commander, she said. Just Voss. We're informal when we're not getting shot at. Steve. I know. Whole base is talking about you. She released his hand and turned to Amidala. We have a mission window closing in 30 hours. Supply depot on Horde Mantel. Lightly guarded by Imperial standards, critical to their operations in 3 adjacent sectors. If we hit it hard and fast, we cripple their logistics for weeks. You're suggesting the captain's first operation be a frontal assault on an Imperial installation? Mon Mothma's eyebrows rose. That's either brave or suicidal. It's necessary, and if he's half as good as reports suggest, we might actually pull it off without losing the entire team. Voss looked at Steve. You good with that? No warm-up missions, no training scenarios. Straight into the fire. Steve thought about the Battle of New York, about dropping out of a flying aircraft carrier into an alien invasion with nothing but a shield and a plan that barely qualified as a plan. He thought about Sokovia, about fighting robots while a city flew through the air. He thought about every mission where the odds were impossible and the only choice was to fight anyway. Let's go. Voss's grin was sharp and approving. Knew I'd like you. Come on. We've got equipment to requisition and a squad to meet. Hope you're good with a blaster, because your shield won't stop everything. They left the command center together, Voss setting a pace that forced Steve to stretch his enhanced stride. Behind them, the leadership continued their debate, weighing risks and opportunities in the eternal calculus of rebellion. But Steve was done with councils and planning. He was a soldier, and soldiers belonged in the field. Voss led him through the temple's maze-like corridors to an armory that was really more of a converted ritual chamber, its walls still bearing faded murals of beings locked in eternal struggle. Symbolic, isn't it? Voss said, catching his gaze. Fighting a war inside monuments to civilizations that failed. Makes you wonder if we're just repeating old mistakes, or learning from them. You're an optimist. That'll get beaten out of you quick. She accessed a weapons locker with a code that required 3 separate authentications, then started pulling equipment. Blaster carbine. Standard rebel modification. Semi-automatic with a full charge, good for 40 shots. Thermal detonators, 2. Comlink encrypted to our frequency. Medical kit. And body armor, though based on what I've heard, you might not need it. Steve examined the blaster, feeling its weight, its balance. The technology was beyond anything from his time, but the principles were universal. Point, fire, maintain discipline. He holstered it awkwardly, unused to the feel of an energy weapon against his hip. How accurate is this? In your hands. We'll find out. Most soldiers can't hit anything past 20 meters without computer assistance, but I'm guessing you're not most soldiers. Had some practice. Voss snorted, slotting a power pack into her own rifle with the ease of long familiarity. Your file says you disabled 8 stormtroopers in under a minute without killing any of them. That true? They were just following orders. Didn't seem right to execute them for that. You realize that mercy is going to cost us? Every stormtrooper you spare is another enemy we face later. Steve's jaw tightened. I draw the line at summary execution. They surrender, they live. That's not negotiable. Voss studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. You're going to hate this war, Steve. It doesn't allow for moral clarity, but I respect the conviction. Just don't get my team killed trying to save people who'd put a bolt through your skull without a second thought. I won't. They geared up in silence, each checking their equipment with the ritualistic focus of soldiers preparing for combat. Steve strapped the shield to his arm, feeling its familiar weight settle like an old friend returning. Voss watched him with obvious curiosity, but she didn't ask about the shield's composition or capabilities. That was good. Steve wasn't sure he could explain vibranium to people whose periodic table probably looked nothing like Earth's. Teams waiting in Bay 7, Voss said. Fair warning, they're good, but they're rough. Half are former Republic military who refuse to bow to the Empire. Other half are idealists who think we can win through clever tactics and superior morals. You're about to discover which type you prefer. Bay 7 was dominated by a battered transport that looked like it had survived more battles than its designers intended. Its hull was scarred with badly repaired blaster damage, and the landing gear tilted at an angle that suggested structural compromise. But the engines hummed with solid power, and the weapons emplacements tracked smoothly through their arcs. A crew of 7 stood around the boarding ramp, arguing good-naturedly about something Steve couldn't follow. They fell silent as Voss approached, snapping to a kind of informal attention that spoke more to respect than military discipline. Steve studied them openly, cataloging details. A Twi'lek male with a sniper rifle that was almost as long as he was tall. A human woman whose fingers were stained with grease and whose cybernetic eyes glowed faintly blue. A Zabrak whose horns had been filed down but whose muscles suggested formidable close-quarters capability. 2 humans, male and female, who carried themselves with the synchronized awareness of partners who had fought together too long to need words. And a droid, battered and mismatched, whose optical sensors tracked Steve with analytical intensity. "This is Captain Steve Rogers," Voss announced. "He's joining us for the Horde Mantel op." "Yes, he's the one from the incident report." "No, you may not ask about the shield until we're clear of the mission." "Questions?" The Twi'lek raised a hand. "Can he shoot?" "We'll find out." "That's comforting." "Shut up, Shen." "Steve, the comedian is Shen-Ul. Best shot in 3 sectors, but compensates for skill with endless chatter. The mechanic is Kira. She can fix anything that has moving parts and some things that don't. Zabrak with anger management issues is Gorak. Twins who finish each other's sentences are Lev and Mira, and the droid is Bucket. Designation B7CK3T, the droid corrected in a voice like gravel in a disposal unit. Commander Voss insists on improper nomenclature. "Because saying your full designation takes too long when someone's shooting at us." Voss checked her chrono. "We lift in 20 minutes. Stow your gear and strap in. Hyperspace toward Mantel is 16 hours, so get comfortable." The team dispersed to their stations with the efficiency of long practice. Steve found himself next to Kira, who was running final diagnostics on the transport systems with the aid of her cybernetic eyes. She glanced at him, taking in the shield with visible skepticism. "That thing actually work?" "Every time. Violates about 7 principles of materials science." "What's it made of?" "Vibranium. It's a metal from my world." "Your world?" Kira's laugh was sharp. "Right. Bale's briefing said you claim to be from another reality. You realize how insane that sounds. I've got no reason to lie." "Maybe not. But reality doesn't care about reasons. Physics has rules." She tapped her temple where the cybernetics merged with flesh. "These eyes can analyze molecular structures. Let me scan your shield. I'll prove whatever exotic metal you have came from this galaxy." Steve hesitated, then held out the shield. Kira's eyes flickered through spectrum shifts, projecting data across her optical display that only she could see. Her expression went from confident to confused to deeply disturbed in the space of 3 seconds. "What the hell? The atomic structure doesn't match anything in the database. It's absorbing energy at the quantum level and redistributing it through a lattice that shouldn't be stable. This shouldn't exist, but it does." "Yeah." Kira handed the shield back, like it might bite her. "Okay, maybe you're telling the truth. Or maybe you're from some secret Imperial research project that's 20 years ahead of known science. Either way, I'm keeping my distance until I understand what you are." Shen-Ul appeared, draping an arm over Steve's shoulders with the ease of someone who respected no personal space. "Don't mind Kira. She trusts machines more than people. Sensible in this galaxy." Me, I trust anyone who's willing to punch stormtroopers. You punch good, good enough. Excellent. I ask because sometimes we run out of ammunition, and backup plans become very personal very fast. Shenal's grin was infectious. You ever kill anyone, Captain? Steve's expression went flat. More than I can count, less than I wanted to. The grin faded slightly. Shenal studied Steve with eyes that suddenly looked older than his apparent years. Good answer. Means you're not a sociopath or a liar. Both get you killed in this work. He removed his arm and stepped back. I think we'll get along fine. The transport lifted on schedule, its engines roaring against Yavin 4's gravity well before breaking atmosphere and arrowing toward the darkness of space. Steve strapped himself into a jump seat and watched through the viewport as the jungle moon shrank beneath them, giving way to the vast, empty beauty of the galaxy. Stars hung in configurations he didn't recognize, forming constellations that told stories to cultures he had never heard of. It was beautiful, and terrible and overwhelming, the sheer scale of the galaxy dwarfing anything he had experienced on Earth. Hyperspace was stranger still, reality stretched like taffy, stars becoming streaks of light that flowed past the hull in patterns that hurt to watch. Steve's stomach lurched, adapting to sensations his body was never designed to handle. Around him, the team went about their business with casual indifference, having made this trip so many times that impossible physics no longer registered as noteworthy. Voss emerged from the cockpit and dropped into the seat beside Steve, her expression thoughtful. You're handling this better than most first-timers. Usually, people spend their first hyperspace jump vomiting or praying. I've been through weirder. Quantum realm, mirror dimensions, time travel. You get used to reality not making sense. Time travel? Voss's eyebrows rose. You're saying your people mastered temporal mechanics? Not mastered. Survived. There's a difference. Voss nodded slowly, as if confirming a suspicion. You're from the future. That's why you seem so sure about everything. You've already seen how this plays out. No, Steve's voice was firm. I'm from the past. From a war that ended before your empire existed. I slept through time, woke up when I was needed, and kept fighting. Then I got thrown here. I don't know your future any better than you do, but you've seen tyranny defeated before. Yes. How? Steve thought about Captain America leading troops through Nazi-occupied Europe, about the Howling Commandos liberating camps and shattering supply lines. He thought about the slow grind of years, the victories measured in miles of liberated territory and lists of names no longer enslaved. He thought about the price, counted in graves scattered across a continent, with a lot of blood and suffering, with ordinary people deciding that dying free was better than living under a boot, with soldiers like you fighting battles nobody remembered because they weren't glamorous enough for the history books. He met Voss's gaze. And with leaders who understood that winning the war meant preserving the humanity you were fighting for. No shortcuts, no compromises that turned you into the thing you hated. Voss was quiet for a long time. Around them, the hyperspace tunnel continued its impossible dance, carrying them toward a battle neither could predict. Finally, she nodded. That's going to be harder than it sounds. The Empire doesn't just control the galaxy, it controls the narrative. Every victory we achieve, they spin it as terrorism. Every civilian we save, they claim we endangered. They've made resistance synonymous with chaos. Then you show them the difference. You fight clean, you fight hard, and you make sure that when people look at you, they see what the Empire isn't. We've tried that. It doesn't always work. It has to. Because the moment you start using their methods, you've already lost. The war might continue, but the cause dies. Voss studied him with an expression that was equal parts frustration and grudging respect. You sound like the Jedi used to. All that talk about the high ground and moral clarity. Look where it got them. Where did it get them? dead or hiding. The Empire hunted them down because they couldn't adapt, couldn't compromise enough to survive. Vader killed them personally, one by one, because they thought being right was the same as being strong. Steve shook his head. Being right is what makes you strong. Without that, you're just another person with a weapon, no different from the people you're fighting. The Jedi fell because they were betrayed, not because they were wrong. Maybe. Voss didn't sound convinced. Or maybe they fell because the dark side is stronger than the light, and pretending otherwise is suicidal. I don't believe that. I've seen the worst humanity can produce. I've fought it. And every time, the people who held on to their principles, who refused to become monsters even when it seemed like the smart choice, those were the ones who won in the end. In your galaxy. In any galaxy, evil eats itself eventually. The trick is surviving long enough to see it happen. Voss opened her mouth to respond, then closed it, thinking. The transport shuddered slightly, some minor turbulence in hyperspace that the inertial dampeners couldn't fully absorb. Bucket rolled past them, running diagnostics with single-minded focus. Gorak was sharpening his vibro blade with strokes that sent sparks dancing across the cargo bay. And through it all, Steve sat with his shield on his lap, a circular reminder that some symbols transcended the galaxies that birthed them. They spent the rest of the hyperspace jump preparing for combat in ways that ranged from practical to superstitious. Shenal cleaned his rifle, disassembling it completely and checking every component with the care of someone whose life depended on mechanical precision. Kira ran simulations of the depot's layout, mapping entry points and escape routes with her cybernetic eyes. Lev and Mira played a game with dice and cards that seemed to have no consistent rules, but kept them both engaged. And Voss briefed Steve on the mission parameters, using a holo projector to display the target in 3 dimensions. The depot was built into an asteroid, taking advantage of natural caverns to store supplies bound for Imperial fleets operating in the Outer Rim. Intelligence suggested minimal garrison, mostly logistics personnel and cargo droids, but the facility had shield generators, automated turrets, and direct communication links to the nearest Star Destroyer patrol. The mission window was narrow: get in, plant charges, extract before reinforcements arrived. Estimated time from insertion to extraction, 32 minutes. "What's our backup plan if things go wrong?" Steve asked. Voss smiled grimly. "We die. This isn't the kind of operation that allows for contingencies. We succeed fast, or we don't succeed at all. Then we better succeed. That's the spirit." They emerged from hyperspace in the Horde Mantel system precisely on schedule, reality snapping back into normal configuration with a disorienting lurch. The asteroid belt spread before them like a frozen river of debris, thousands of rocks tumbling through space in orbital paths that would take lifetimes to fully map. Voss piloted them into the belt with casual expertise, using the asteroids as cover while they approached the depot from an angle that Imperial sensors reportedly found difficult to monitor. Steve pressed against the viewport, studying their target. It was larger than he'd expected, the asteroid probably 5 kilometers across at its widest point. Docking ports studded its surface like mechanical barnacles. Turret emplacements tracked in slow patterns, covering approach vectors with overlapping fields of fire. And at the asteroid's north pole, a communications array powerful enough to punch signals through hyperspace to any Imperial facility in the sector. Lights glowed from interior caverns, visible through transparasteel viewports that had been carved into the rock itself. "Entry point is on the dark side," Voss said, bringing the transport around in a curve that used a particularly large asteroid for cover. Maintenance access for cargo droids. Poorly monitored because the Empire assumes anything approaching from that angle would be detected by their long-range sensors. "And they won't detect us?" "Not unless our intelligence is catastrophically wrong." Kira's jamming their frequencies while projecting a false signature that reads as asteroid debris. We'll have maybe 2 minutes before their systems realize something's off. 2 minutes to dock, breach, and establish position inside an Imperial facility. Steve had worked with tighter windows, but not often. The transport's docking clamps extended, magnetic locks engaging with the maintenance port with a series of metallic thuds that echoed through the hull. Voss killed the engines, leaving them in silence broken only by the hiss of equalizing pressure. The team moved to the airlock with practiced coordination, weapons ready, faces set in expressions that ranged from focused determination to barely contained violence. "Remember," Voss said, her voice carrying the weight of command despite her insistence on informality. "We're not here to fight. We're here to sabotage. Avoid contact if possible. Shoot to disable if necessary. And if we encounter serious resistance, we extract immediately. No heroics, no last stands. We live to fight another day. Clear?" Affirmatives echoed through the team. Steve checked his blaster, ensuring the safety was off and the charge pack fully seated. The shield hung on his arm, its weight comforting in a way nothing else in this galaxy had managed. The airlock cycled, depressurizing with a hiss that made his ears pop. Then the inner door opened, revealing a maintenance tunnel carved through solid rock and lined with glowing panels that provided barely adequate illumination. They moved in. The tunnel was cramped, forcing them to advance in single file with Gorak on point and Bucket bringing up the rear. Steve found himself in the middle of the formation, surrounded by people he'd known for less than a day, trusting them with his life because he had no other choice. The tunnel branched and rebranched, a maze designed by people who prioritized function over navigation. But Kira had studied the schematics during hyperspace, and she guided them with quiet confidence, her cybernetic eyes seeing paths that others would have missed. They emerged into a cargo bay the size of an aircraft hangar. Crates stacked 3 stories high filled the space, organized by some logic that probably made sense to Imperial logistics but looked random to Steve's eye. Cargo droids moved between the stacks, their repulsor lifts humming as they shifted containers marked with symbols Steve didn't recognize. No human personnel visible, no stormtroopers. Just the quiet hum of industrial activity in a facility confident of its security. Voss signaled for a halt, her hand gestures economical and clear. Shenal moved to an elevated position, his rifle trained on the far exit. Lev and Mira split up, each taking a different approach vector. And Voss gestured Steve and Gorak forward, indicating they should secure the central area while Kira planted the charges. Steve moved low and fast, using the crates for cover, the shield held ready but not raised. His enhanced hearing picked up the droid's mechanical chatter, the hum of environmental systems, the distant echo of footsteps that might have been human or might have been another droid. They were halfway across the bay when alarms screamed. Not proximity alarms, not security alerts, but the kind of shrieking klaxon that meant catastrophic failure of primary systems. Steve's instinct was to take cover, but Voss was already moving, sprinting toward the exit with the team following in a ragged line. Steve fell in beside her, matching her pace easily despite the awkward terrain. "What happened?" he shouted over the alarms. "No idea. Either our intelligence was wrong or something else just went very bad." Voss keyed her comlink, yelling over the noise. "Kira, status. Charges aren't armed yet. I need 3 more minutes." "We don't have 3 minutes." "Abort and extract." "Negative. We came here to do a job. I'm finishing it." Voss cursed with impressive creativity, then changed direction, leading the team deeper into the facility instead of back toward their entry point. Steve followed without question, trusting her judgment even as every instinct screamed to get out while they still could. They burst through a blast door into a corridor filled with running personnel, Imperial technicians in gray uniforms scattering at the sight of armed intruders. Some raised their hands, others reached for comlinks. Gorak stunned two with precise blaster shots before they could report, and then stormtroopers appeared at the far end of the corridor, their white armor brilliant under the emergency lighting. "Contact," Voss snapped, dropping to one knee and opening fire. Her blaster was set to full auto, spitting bolts in a pattern that forced the stormtroopers to take cover. Shenal appeared at a junction, his rifle accounting for one trooper with a headshot that was more art than violence. Lev and Mira flanked, their synchronized movements creating crossfire that pinned the Imperials in a killing zone. But more were coming, drawn by the alarms and the sound of combat. Steve heard boots pounding on metal, the clatter of weapons being readied, the clipped commands of sergeants organizing a response. "Gorak, Steve, hold this corridor," Voss ordered. "Everyone else, with me. We're getting Kira and getting out." She vanished into a side passage, taking most of the team with her. Steve found himself alone with the Zabrak, facing a corridor that was rapidly filling with stormtroopers. Gorak grinned, his filed horns giving him a demonic aspect in the red emergency lighting. "Ever fought in a corridor? Once or twice? Then you know it's all about controlling the fatal funnel. They have to come through that door. We make them regret it." Steve raised the shield, feeling its familiar weight settle, and moved forward. The stormtroopers opened fire, a volley of blaster bolts that should have cut him down in the first second. But the shield was there, catching bolt after bolt, each impact ringing against vibranium with tones that sounded almost musical. Steve angled the deflections deliberately, sending bolts ricocheting into walls and ceiling, creating chaos without causing unnecessary casualties. Behind him, Gorak fired with brutal efficiency, his shots finding gaps in armor that stormtroopers thought were protected. Steve closed the distance in a sprint that covered 30 meters in seconds. The shield hit the lead stormtrooper like a battering ram, sending him flying backward into his squadmates. Steve followed through, using the shield's edge to strike weapon hands and helmet seals, disabling without killing, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to fight in the confines of a Hydra bunker. A trooper tried to grab him. Steve used his momentum to throw the man into a wall, the impact sufficient to crack armor without breaking bones. Another fired point blank. The shield absorbed the bolt, and Steve's return punch shattered the trooper's weapon, rendering him harmless. In 30 seconds, 6 stormtroopers were down. Gorak was laughing, a sound like rocks grinding together, his vibroblade flickering as he cut through armor with strokes that spoke of Zabrak fighting traditions older than the Empire. They held the corridor for what felt like hours but was probably less than 3 minutes, an eternity measured in heartbeats and the constant ring of blaster impacts against vibranium. Then Voss's voice crackled through Steve's comlink. "Charges armed. Extract now." Steve and Gorak ran, trading fire with pursuing stormtroopers who were smart enough to keep their distance from the shield. They made it back to the cargo bay to find the rest of the team already moving toward their entry tunnel. Kira was running despite a smoking blaster burn on her shoulder, Bucket supporting her with mechanical efficiency. Shenal provided cover fire from a gantry, his shots precise enough to make the stormtroopers think twice about pursuit. They piled into the transport with seconds to spare, the airlock sealing just as blaster fire hammered into the hull. Voss hit the engines, tearing away from the docking port with acceleration that made the artificial gravity struggle to compensate. The depot's turret swiveled toward them, tracking their escape vector. Then Kira triggered the charges, and the asteroid bloomed with light. The explosion was silent in vacuum but beautiful in its violence. Secondary detonations rippled through the facility as fuel stores ignited and ammunition cooked off. Voss flew through the shockwave, using it to accelerate their escape, the transport shields flaring as debris hammered against them. Steve watched through the viewport as the depot came apart in slow motion, its structure compromised beyond recovery. Fires bloomed in chambers, suddenly exposed to vacuum. Escape pods launched, carrying survivors into the asteroid field where they would drift until Imperial search and rescue could reach them. That's going to hurt their logistics, Voss said with grim satisfaction. 3 months of supplies gone. Fleet operations in this sector crippled. And we made it out with 0 fatalities. The team erupted in ragged cheers, the adrenaline of survival overwhelming the fear that had driven them through combat. Steve found himself grinning despite the exhaustion settling into his bones. It had been a perfect operation by any measure. Quick, devastating, achieved with minimal casualties on both sides. The kind of raid that hurt the enemy's capability without descending into the mindless slaughter that characterized too many battles. But as they made the jump to hyperspace, leaving Ord Mantel behind, Steve couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. In the depot's corridors, fighting alongside people from a galaxy not his own, he had felt a familiar purpose settle back into his chest. The mission had given him something to be, someone to protect, a cause that demanded everything he had and promised nothing in return except the knowledge that he'd done what was right. He was Captain America again. Even here, in a galaxy so far from Earth that the word itself had no meaning, he was a soldier, a symbol, a man who stood between civilians and the darkness because someone had to, and he'd been given the strength to do it. The serum had made him physically capable. But this, the willingness to step forward when others stepped back, that came from something deeper, something that no amount of distance or dimensional rifts could erase. Voss dropped into the seat beside him, her expression thoughtful as she studied his face. You fought well, better than well. I've never seen anyone use a shield like that. It's like you've been doing it your whole life, long enough. That corridor defense, you disabled 6 stormtroopers without killing any of them, in close quarters combat, while under sustained fire. She shook her head. That shouldn't be possible. Killing them wouldn't have made us safer, just would have made more widows. Stormtroopers are conscripts or clones. Most don't have families in any meaningful sense. Doesn't matter. They're people. They deserve a chance to reconsider their choices. Voss was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. That's going to make you very popular with some factions in the rebellion, and very frustrating to others. People like Mon Mothma who understand that war requires calculated brutality. I've fought wars before, won them too. Never had to compromise who I was to do it. Different wars, different galaxy, same principles. You start executing prisoners, burning villages, doing whatever it takes to win, you lose the thing that made you worth fighting for in the first place. Steve's voice was firm but not harsh. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying it's necessary. Voss studied him with an expression that might have been respect or pity. We'll see. This was a soft target. Wait until we're up against Death Troopers or Inquisitors or Vader himself. Then tell me about principles. I will. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. You know what? I believe you. You're either the bravest person I've ever met, or the most naive. Possibly both. She stood, stretching out muscles sore from combat. Get some rest. We'll be back at Yavin in 14 hours, and then the real work begins. Command is going to want to debrief you, analyze what you did, figure out how to replicate it. Can't replicate it. The shield is one of a kind. Not the shield, you, the way you fight, the way you inspire. People are going to hear about this mission, about the soldier who took on an Imperial squad without fear, who protected his team and still showed mercy to enemies. That's powerful, Steve. The rebellion needs powerful. She left him alone with his thoughts and the hyperspace tunnel that stretched endlessly outside the viewport. Steve closed his eyes, not sleeping but meditating in the way he'd learned during the war, letting his mind settle and his body recover from the adrenaline spike of combat. He thought about Peggy, about what she would say if she could see him now. Fighting Nazis was one thing. Fighting an interstellar empire that made the Third Reich look provincial was something else entirely. But the principles remained the same. Tyranny was tyranny, oppression was oppression, and where innocent people suffered, someone had to stand up and say no. It didn't matter if that someone came from Earth or Alderaan or any of the 1,000 worlds in this impossibly vast galaxy. What mattered was the willingness to act, to take the blow that was meant for someone weaker, to hold the line when every instinct screamed to run. Steve Rogers had done it for 70 years, across 2 different centuries and more battles than he cared to remember. He could do it for one more war, even if this war never ended, even if he never saw Earth again, even if the only legacy he left was the memory of a man who refused to kneel, who carried a shield painted with colors that meant nothing here but somehow still symbolized everything worth protecting. The serum had given him strength and speed and healing, but it hadn't given him purpose. That came from somewhere deeper, from the scrawny kid in Brooklyn who got beaten up in alleys because he couldn't stand to watch bullies operate without opposition. That kid was still inside him, still driving him forward, still convinced that the world could be better if people were just willing to fight for it. Steve opened his eyes as the hyperspace tunnel continued its impossible journey, carrying him toward a destiny he hadn't chosen but would embrace anyway. Because that's what soldiers did. They adapted. They overcame. They protected those who couldn't protect themselves. And if Captain America could do that on Earth, he could damn well do it across the stars. The Force might shape this galaxy's destiny, might be the difference between Jedi and Sith, between light and darkness. But Steve Rogers didn't need the Force. He had something simpler, something that couldn't be taught or channeled or corrupted by power. He had conviction, and in a galaxy that had forgotten what conviction looked like without compromise, that might be the most dangerous weapon of all. The debriefing took 6 hours and left everyone exhausted except Steve, whose enhanced metabolism processed fatigue differently than baseline human biology. He sat across a table from Mon Mothma, Bail Organa, Admiral Akbar, and 3 intelligence officers whose names he immediately forgot, answering questions about tactics, capabilities, and the shield's properties with patient precision. They wanted to quantify him, to understand how he had achieved what their data said was impossible. Steve did his best to explain without revealing details that might give them false hope about replicating his abilities. "The serum is gone," he said for the 3rd time. "The scientist who created it was killed. The formula died with him. I'm not the beginning of a line of super soldiers. I'm the last one." "But your shield," one of the intelligence officers pressed. "If we could study it, reverse engineer the material, we might be able to create armor that could withstand blaster fire. You can study it all you want, but vibranium doesn't exist in your periodic table. It came from a meteor that hit Earth thousands of years ago. There's no natural source in this galaxy, and even if there were, you'd need industrial processes I can't describe." Mon Mothma leaned forward, her fingers steepled. "Then what good are you to us, Captain Rogers? If we can't replicate your abilities, if the shield is unique, how do we leverage your presence into strategic advantage? The same way you leverage any soldier. You give me missions that require what I can do. You put me where the fighting matters, and you let people see that resistance is possible." "Symbols," Mon Mothma said with distaste. "We've tried symbols. They get killed, and then we're worse off than before because people lose hope twice as hard. I'm not easy to kill. Neither were the Jedi." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Steve held Mon Mothma's gaze, reading the exhaustion there. The years of making impossible choices and watching good people die for principles that seemed increasingly abstract. He understood her cynicism, but he couldn't accept it as the only valid response to tragedy. "The Jedi were betrayed from within," Steve said quietly, "by someone they trusted. That's not a failure of strength or capability, it's the inevitable vulnerability of trust. But the alternative is worse. If you stop trusting, stop building towards something better because you're afraid of betrayal, then you've already surrendered to the Empire's vision of the galaxy." Bail smiled faintly. "He has a point." Monday. We've become so focused on survival that we've forgotten how to inspire. Captain Rogers represents something we've lost, or something we never had, Mon Mothma countered. This isn't the Republic, Bail. We're not defenders of an established order. We're insurgents fighting an enemy that controls everything. Our strength is secrecy, subtlety, the ability to strike and vanish before the Empire can respond. Captain Rogers is none of those things, which is exactly why we need him. Admiral Akbar's voice carried the weight of naval combat experience. The Empire expects us to hide, expects us to operate in shadows and strike from ambush. Captain Rogers changes that calculation. He allows us to fight openly, to hold ground, to defend instead of always retreating. At what cost? Mon Mothma looked at Steve directly. The moment you become too visible, the moment the Emperor decides you're a genuine threat, he won't send stormtroopers. He'll send Vader. And when Vader comes, he doesn't leave survivors. Steve absorbed that, understanding the fear beneath her words. She'd lost people to Vader, perhaps many people, and now she was being asked to trust that Steve could succeed where others had failed. It was unfair to expect immediate confidence. Trust was earned through actions, not words. Then let's make sure I'm worth the risk, Steve said. Give me another mission, something harder than Ord Mantel. Show me what you consider impossible, and I'll show you what I can do. Mon Mothma studied him for a long moment, then looked to Bail, who nodded slightly. The intelligence officers exchanged glances. Admiral Akbar's expression was unreadable, but his silence suggested consideration rather than dismissal. Finally, Mon Mothma reached for a datapad and activated a holographic display that materialized above the table. The image showed a planet Steve didn't recognize, blue, green, and beautiful, with sprawling continents and deep oceans. Cities glittered across its surface like scattered jewels. But as the image zoomed in, Steve saw the scars, burned regions, craters, and in orbit, a star destroyer that loomed over the planet like a predator. Corvan 4, Mon Mothma said. Agri-world in the mid-rim. Population of 3 million. Primary exports are grain and processed nutrients. 6 months ago, the Empire decided the planet wasn't meeting its production quotas. They installed a garrison, arrested the planetary governor, and began strip mining the agricultural regions for raw materials while forcing the population into labor camps. Steve's jaw tightened. How many have died? Conservative estimates, 50,000. Starvation, exhaustion, summary executions for failure to meet quotas. Mon Mothma's voice was clinical, but her eyes held rage. We've tried to help, smuggled in medical supplies, evacuated a few thousand refugees, but the Star Destroyer makes any large-scale operation impossible, and the garrison is dug in so deep that conventional assault would cost us more personnel than we can afford to lose. What do you need me to do? Lead a rescue operation. There's a camp outside the capital city holding approximately 10,000 prisoners, men, women, children, all scheduled for transfer to Imperial labor worlds where they'll work until they die. We have a 20-hour window when the Star Destroyer will be undergoing maintenance and can't provide orbital support. In that window, you need to breach the camp, evacuate as many prisoners as possible, and extract before Imperial reinforcements arrive. Steve studied the hologram, noting guard towers, patrol patterns, the distance from the camp to the nearest spaceport where evacuation ships could land. It was a nightmare scenario by any tactical standard. Too many guards, too many civilians, too many variables that could go catastrophically wrong, but the alternative was letting 10,000 people be shipped off to slow death in mines or factories. What kind of support do I have? 2 squads in addition to Voss's team. Transport capacity for 6,000 if we push every ship to maximum load. Medical staff to triage the wounded. And 15 minutes of aerial cover from our Y-wings before they need to extract to avoid the Star Destroyer's sensor range. That's not enough ships. No, it's not. Mon Mothma's expression was bleak, which means you'll have to choose who gets saved and who gets left behind. Welcome to the reality of rebellion, Captain. We don't get to save everyone. Steve was quiet, staring at the hologram, at the representations of human beings reduced to tactical considerations and resource allocation. 60 years ago, he'd faced similar choices in Europe. Liberating one camp meant leaving another to suffer longer. Prioritizing bridge demolition meant villages staying occupied. War was always about impossible choices, but knowing that didn't make them easier. I'll need a day to study the plans and brief the teams. You have 12 hours. We move in 13. Mon Mothma deactivated the hologram. And Captain, if you fail, if you get captured or killed, the Empire will parade your body across every holonet channel in the galaxy. They'll turn you into a symbol of failed rebellion. So don't fail. She left the briefing room without waiting for a response, her footsteps echoing down the corridor with the sound of someone carrying unbearable weight. Bale remained, his expression sympathetic, but resigned. She's harsh. But she's right. This mission is beyond dangerous. If you want to refuse, no one will think less of you. I'm not refusing. Those people need help. Many people need help, Steve. You can't save them all. Maybe not. But I can save some. And if I don't try, what was the point of everything that led me here? Bale smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. You remind me of someone I knew, a Jedi. She used to say similar things, that every life mattered, that you couldn't weigh one person's suffering against strategic necessity. His smile faded. The Empire killed her for it. I'm sorry. So am I. But she died believing what you believe. And maybe that's worth something, even if it didn't save her. Bale stood, gathering his datapads. I'll make sure you have access to all our intelligence on Corvan 4. The rest is up to you. Steve spent the next 12 hours in a blur of planning and preparation. He pored over satellite imagery, guard rotation schedules, architectural schematics of the camp itself. The facility was disturbingly efficient in its design, with overlapping fields of fire from guard towers, a single entry point that could be locked down in seconds, and barracks positioned close enough that reinforcements could deploy in under a minute. Whoever had designed it understood how to secure a large prisoner population with minimal personnel, but efficiency created predictability. Steve identified 3 weaknesses in the design. The guard towers were automated, relying on motion sensors and thermal imaging rather than human observation. That made them vulnerable to electronic warfare. The prisoner barracks were constructed from prefabricated materials that wouldn't survive sustained blaster fire, which meant creating multiple exit points wouldn't require demolitions expertise. And the camp's power supply came from a single generator that, if disabled, would trigger emergency protocols that prioritized securing Imperial personnel rather than maintaining prisoner containment. It was a plan built on assumptions and hope. But it was a plan. Steve briefed Voss's team and the 2 additional squads in a hangar bay that echoed with the sounds of ships being prepped for combat. 37 people stared at him with expressions ranging from eager to skeptical, united only by the fact that they'd all volunteered for a mission with terrible odds. Steve walked them through the plan step by step, using a holographic projector to show approach vectors, breach points, rally positions. Our goal is evacuation, not engagement, he emphasized. We're not here to fight the Empire. We're here to get civilians out of a death camp. That means speed, discipline, and accepting that we can't save everyone. The transport capacity limits us to 6,000. We'll prioritize children, medical cases, and anyone who's critical to planetary resistance networks. Adults who can survive Imperial captivity longer will have to be left behind. The words felt like ash in his mouth. But there was no alternative. They didn't have unlimited ships or unlimited time. The math was brutal and unforgiving, and pretending otherwise would get people killed who didn't have to die. A young human woman raised her hand, her expression troubled. How do we choose? How do we tell someone they're staying behind while their child gets on a transport? Steve met her gaze without flinching. We don't. We tell them the truth, that we're doing everything we can, that we'll be back, and that they need to survive until we can return. Then we make damn sure we keep that promise and come back for them. The Empire will move them before we can mount a second operation. Then we hit the transports before they reach their destination, or we sabotage the labor world's infrastructure, or we find another way. Steve's voice was firm. But we don't give up on people just because rescuing them is complicated. The woman nodded slowly, not entirely convinced but willing to follow his lead. Around her, other team members seemed to settle into acceptance of the mission's parameters. Steve continued the briefing, covering contingencies for Imperial reinforcements, procedures for medical triage, and extraction protocols if the Star Destroyer returned earlier than expected. By the end, everyone understood their role. More importantly, they understood the stakes. One last thing, Steve said as the briefing concluded. Some of you are going to be tempted to engage Imperial forces beyond what's strictly necessary, to make them pay for what they've done to those prisoners. I understand that impulse, but revenge isn't our mission. If we get distracted trying to punish guards, we reduce the time available for evacuation, and that means people who could have survived won't. So stay focused, stay professional, and remember why we're doing this. They dispersed to their ships, moving with the controlled urgency of soldiers who knew the mission clock was ticking. Steve found himself alone in the hangar bay with his shield and his thoughts, listening to the sounds of engines warming and crews running final checks. Bale appeared from the shadows, his expression grave. The transport I'm assigning you has medical bays and extra ration supplies. It should help with the civilians once you extract. Thank you, Steve. Bale's voice dropped. If this goes wrong, if you're captured, the Empire will interrogate you with methods that break even the strongest minds. They'll want to know everything about the rebellion, about our networks, about our plans. Promise me you won't let them take you alive. Steve looked at the older man, reading the fear there, the knowledge that everyone Bale cared about lived under the shadow of Imperial torture chambers. I've been captured before. I got out. Not from Vader. Then I'll find a way. Bale shook his head but didn't argue further. They clasped hands, and Steve felt the weight of trust being placed in him, the fragile hope that maybe this soldier from another galaxy could achieve what years of careful rebellion hadn't managed. Then Bale was gone, and Steve was boarding the transport where Voss and her team waited with weapons ready and expressions set for combat. The flight to Corvan 4 took 8 hours through hyperspace, giving Steve time to rest and mentally prepare for what was coming. He found himself thinking about the camps in Europe, about the faces of people he'd helped liberate, the way hope and horror mixed in their expressions as American soldiers tore down fences and shot locks off barracks doors. This would be the same. Different galaxy, different enemy. Same basic evil of reducing human beings to disposable resources. They emerged from hyperspace on the far side of Corvan 4's moon, using it to mask their approach. The planet hung in space like a wounded jewel, its beauty marred by the visible scars of Imperial exploitation. The Star Destroyer was visible in high orbit, its maintenance already underway based on the lack of TIE patrols. That gave them the window they needed. Voss piloted their transport toward the surface with the rest of their small fleet following in tight formation, 37 soldiers and 3 transports against a garrison of 200 Imperial troops. The odds were terrible. The cause was just. And Captain America, shield strapped to his arm and conviction burning in his chest, prepared to show the Empire what one man could do when he refused to calculate the cost of doing what was right.